And I will share my screen. Okay, so is everyone seeing my screen?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So we
Yeah.
want to welcome everyone again to Environmental Fridays. It is personal. This is our 7th season. You can see here the website link to Environmental Fridays. And here you can see a QR code that will take you there to the website. For this semester, this season, we will have 15 episodes, 16 guest speakers today, and you could see that we've had speakers from a variety of places. Today, our speakers, I would say, comes from Trinidad and Tobago, my home country. And this has been is the operative word here. It's like, wow, November is pretty much done. So this was our schedule here for November. Our last episode will be next week, Friday. One of my colleagues here at Andrews University will present on green architecture. Today we will hear from Nikia Gooden about Tobago oil spill and satellites. So I'm assuming based on what this topic is today, that it's mostly dealing with pollution, in particular oil pollution. But as I've said, before, um, these three global threats are all interconnected with each other. So the pollution could lead to, for example, some loss or at least some impact on the biodiversity. And we'll perhaps hear something about that today. My co-host today is a friend for about 2 years or something like that now, Janice.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about
About there.
Yeah, she's a marine ecologist. She has a master's in ecology from the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill, that's in Barbados, Cave Hill, Barbados. And she has a bachelor's in environmental and natural resources management from the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, that's in Trinidad. Part of her interest includes environmental chemistry, conservation biology, and science communication. And so at this time, she would actually start us off with giving us sort of a summary, I guess, about the Tobago oil spill. And then she will introduce our guest speaker for today. Janice?
Hey, right. Good morning, everybody. Glad to have you guys here. So just a quick summary. On February 7th of this year, an unnamed barge, well, previously a name now identified as the Gulfstream, capsized just off of Tobago's southwestern coast near Cove. And the type of fuel or the oil that was spilled was actually called bunker fuel, which is a common type of oil or fuel used for transport vessels. Some of the major effects of this oil spill were actually fouling of the coastline because it affected a large area of Tobago's southwestern coast. And combined with the oil spill, there was also the issue of sargassum. We have large sargassum blooms that come inshore. So TEMA, which is the Tobago Environmental Management Authority, as well as other companies such as Tiger Tanks and so on, all pooled together resources to be able to assist with cleanup. Now, certain local businesses didn't have as much negative impacts of the oil spill. However, a few did, where they experienced vapor from the oil on tables and chairs. They experienced customers turning away, complaining about the food tasting like oil. And overall, the total cost of cleanup is estimated to be around 30 million US dollars. Now, the central government has given the Tobago House of Assembly 50 million to assist with these cleanup efforts, and we have also been granted access to the International Oil Pollution Fund. To date, 51,000 barrels have been cleaned, as well as 21,000 cubic feet of debris from the barge. However, according to some of my sources, there's still a lot of debris that requires cleaning up, and government is working with international bodies to find the owner of the barge, as well as the tugboat owner that was with the barge, to enforce the polluter pays principle, whereby whoever caused the pollution has to pay and cover the cost of the damages. So over to you, Nikita. Nikia, sorry, my
introduce her.
Yes, that's what I'm going to
Okay.
get to. Just a second, I had it here. They seem to be having some.
So do you want me to introduce her?
Yeah, just a second.
Yeah.
I think we having something. I just had it pulled up, but because I'm on my phone, my computer is not the most efficient.
I could go ahead and introduce her.
Not
So,
a problem.
yeah, so Nikia, our guest speaker today, Mrs. Nikia Gooden, is a research officer in the area of remote sensing at the Institute of Marine Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. She has a master's degree in
What's going on?
geoinformatics, a bachelor's degree, double major in geography and environmental and natural resource management, both from the University of the West Indies. Was this Nikia in Trinidad, in St. Augustine?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So her portfolio at the Institute of Marine Affairs includes supervising the geomatics unit, executing research projects in the unit, providing spatial analysis and modeling. And she is the lead for Trinidad and Tobago for the collaboration on oil spill tracking for the Americas. So she's perfectly suited to tell us all about the Tobago oil spill and satellites. Thank you, Nikia. I will stop sharing and you could, go ahead and share.
Great. I'm just going to confirm that you're seeing the slide on screen.
Not yet.
Okay.
I can see it.
I should be. All right, great. So yeah, I'm Nikia Gooding. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me here. I'm just going to get right into it. So very briefly, the Institute of Marine Affairs, which is where I work, we conduct marine and environmental coastal research, and that goes
Nikia,
to.
I'm still not.
You're still not seeing?
Your slide.
Okay, I can reshare.
Yeah.
Let me know.
Okay, now I'm seeing them.
Now. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah,
Is everybody
so
else good too?
yeah, if we can just
Okay.
Yes.
maybe put a thumbs up or something.
All right, great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so the research that we do feeds straight into policy formation and implementation, as well as towards decision makers. And so we've been mandated by an act of parliament, and I sit within the geomatics unit. So I'm going to briefly just talk about some of the impacts of oil spills as it relates to pollution, and a little bit of sensitization on transboundary spills. So the ITOPF has estimated that between 1970 and 2023, that approximately 3.7 million tons of oil has been spilled into the ocean. And there was an estimation that out of that 3.7 million, that 1.5 million was largely due to tanker oil spills. And each of them were about 7 tons and more. And they all had deleterious impacts on our marine environment. So oil spills happen when spills occur from vessels or whether there's a chronic release. And chronic releases happen to be major environmental issues due to prolonged exposure. And it's particularly important to appraise the impact that they have on the ecosystem in terms of how does it affect its usual functionality, and then what is the period of time that takes for these ecosystems and for the organisms that live therein to be able to have their normal function restored. So there are different mechanisms for oil spill damage. There's physical smothering, there's chemical toxicity, ecological changes, and indirect effects, which each of them having different types of effects on ecosystems and organisms. And, it's just kind of ranging from things such as the ability to move around and swim, the impairment of feeding, reproduction, and even more serious effects like the loss of key organisms and habitat loss. And so it's kind of important to understand how these impacts are scaled, right? Is it on a community level impact? Is it a long-term population impact? So things like feeding and reproduction, or is it just acute effects? And it's important to understand that because it tends to inform how cleanup should happen, how response should be managed. And then, there is the natural processes of dilution and dissipation that tend to help things along. So the marine and coastal environment is impacted mostly by oil spills because of the type of oil that is spilled, where you see lighter oils having more of the toxic effects on a chemical level at first, and then the heavier oils that tend to smother. And so this also helps to inform how it should be response should be managed, but also it indicates very almost immediately what is the severity. So oil type and quantity is very important, and those things then actually impact all of the other kind of variables. So it impacts the behavior in the marine environment. Thick oil behaves very differently to thin oil. Janice would have mentioned that the spill in Tobago was of a bunker fuel. It all behaves very differently through the water column. Ambient conditions. So Desmond earlier would have talked about climate change, and it's what do you call it? Also important to note that oil spills can be impacted by climate change. So for instance, if the ambient conditions are very calm versus if they are pretty choppy because of something like storm surge from a hurricane. We all know that adverse weather patterns and having very direct impacts from our warmer seas, and the warmer seas are affecting the strength, intensification, and frequency of tropical storms and hurricanes. If an oil spill was to happen during this time, it greatly also impacts how the marine environment is going to be affected by the oil. The timing of the oil spill, is it happening during a time like right now where we're now starting to experience winter swells? Or is it something that's happening during a more calmer period of marine weather? The geographic extent, so just very simply, how far and wide is this oil spill impacting? The ecological importance. So, for instance, the vessel that overturned in Tobago was actually lodged near a coral reef, actually a couple of reefs. And so, it immediately made people pretty concerned about those coral reefs that would have been in very close proximity to the vessel. And then the organism sensitivity and vulnerability. So it's particularly important for countries to have a bit of an environmental index mapped for their coastal areas. So, and that will really take into account the organism sensitivity, coastline type, and also the geomorphology of the coastline. Because sandy beaches behave very differently to rocky shores when oil washes up, as well as it really informs as well the type of cleanup response that's needed. For example, if you have mangroves near the water's edge, it is highly vulnerable, but it might not be highly sensitive because a typical healthy mangrove system usually has influxes of tides, right? So as it washes in, it's supposed to also wash out. And so, it might be very vulnerable because of its, or very sensitive because of its nature. Um, Whereas like sandy beaches might be a bit lower, but it might require more for cleanup. And so it's really a matter of understanding the habitats at play and even things like what inhabits the habitats. So is it a spawning season for fish? And are fish going to be using the mangroves as nurseries? It's these kinds of considerations that really help to inform what kind of ecological impact is going to take place when the oil is spilled, as well as the management response. And then you can even take a step further and look at the type of marine life that might be impacted by the oil spills, right? So like plankton, for example, is affected by any change in environmental condition, very sensitive to oil exposure of any type. But because they're so prolific and they tend to have like an overproduction in its younger stages of life, that tends to help because it's almost like you could consider it to be like a compensation. Whereas like fish, adult fish are able to swim away, right? So they're particularly resilient. There's only been a few mass mortality documented, but it's very affected when oil is able to disperse through the water column. And so it's tying back to the type of oil that is being spilled. Marine mammals are particularly vulnerable and they're at risk when they come to surface to breathe or to breach. If there's oil in the water column, when they do so, it tends to harm their nasal tissue, their eyes. We also have to acknowledge species such as the little seal here that are affected because they tend to rely on their body fluid to regulate temperature. And so they are particularly vulnerable because oil, when coating their fur, it tends to inhibit, sorry, that ability to regulate temperature. So they either suffer from like hypothermia or from overheating, depending on, where this happens. And then reptiles such as turtles, marine iguanas and sea snakes, they are all very much affected by oil. Even turtle nests that could be disrupted during cleanup activities. However, there's been many more reports very recently, and this is a bit of hope, that there's been successful cleanup attempts with turtles. And it should be noted that all sea turtles are endangered under the IUCN. Corals are highly sensitive to oil spills, and it takes particularly long for them to recover from oil, as well as any dispersants that are used. So sometimes in oil spill response, dispersants are used to help, as it sounds, break up those oil molecules into smaller bits so it's easier for it to naturally dissipate. And those dispersants have negative effects on coral reefs, and it should not be used in the vicinity of any reef, especially if there is vessel grounding near any reef. Seabirds are higher risk because some species, although they might respond to cleaning, they don't tend to have a very long lifespan after being smothered or coated in oil. And unfortunately, that has been the kind of report that's been shared, so that even though the cleaning might be successful, they either have difficulties with breeding post-cleaning or they just don't survive for very long. There's not a very long, and unfortunately, a higher rate of mortality because of that. With seagrasses, so getting into more like the wetlands and the type of habitats, with seagrasses, floating oil is fine, but if there's anything heavier than floating oil, it tends to smother the seagrasses on the seabed. And even still, if it's floating oil, it tends to affect the ability of the seagrass to photosynthesize because sometimes the ability to capture that sunlight by the seagrass is impacted. And so when the components of the oil mix in the water column, it really would still impact seagrasses. And cleanup is particularly important because these plants can be very easily damaged. And once any of the seagrass blades are damaged, they're not able to photosynthesize and live. Marshes are difficult to clean without damaging the plants as well. It's actually preferred to leave marshes to naturally clean themselves because as long as the bulbs that are buried below the soil surface isn't damaged, they will regrow seasonally. So sometimes it's just a matter of also understanding what you're dealing with and allowing nature to be its own solution. Mangroves are highly vulnerable and they're very sensitive. If the oil impacts its root systems, then the root systems, once blocked, won't be allowed to respire. And so any oil in and around roots will have negative and toxic effects. So long-term damage. There have been reports of marshes and different types of near-shore environments being impacted by oil. It should be noted that if oil has been trapped in a sediment, so in the seabed, in the benthos environment, it takes even longer for recovery for the marine environment because it's now incorporated into the marine environment and creating some sort of longer term exposure. And this is just an idea of how long some of these environments take to recover. So I have here plankton, which is one of the shorter cycles, versus mangroves, which is one of the longer cycles. And it's important to understand this because the natural capacity for recovery helps to inform all monitoring and evaluation planning. So, being able to compare a baseline, so pre-spill, which is from usual environmental monitoring to post-spill studies, and that should really focus on the community level as well as the biodiversity and the productivity of any ecosystem. And of course, it's again very much tied to quantity and type of oil. And then we have human health, because so far we've just been talking about the environment, but we also have to remember that these things very much impact our physical health. And there's been like major groupings based on exposure intensity. There's a lot of studies that have looked at both self-reported symptoms as well as biomarkers, so results from samples in a lab for people who have come into contact in some form or fashion with oil or gas following spills. And so some of the sustained exposure, which are the longer term or more intense exposure intensities, some of those effects can be particularly damaging and lead to mortality and serious morbidity. The fisheries sector is one that we also have to pay attention to because the presence of PAHSs and BAPs, so the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and benzoapyrenes, these tend to have really negative effects in terms of toxicity and tainting when we consume fishing products. And so unfortunately, they've linked some of the intake of PAH and BAPs to carcinogens. And there also has been this kind of acknowledgement from different health regulatory boards, such as the ones in the US and in Europe, where they said there's no actual level of acceptance for PAHs. So even in very small amounts, it can lead to toxicity. And then we have to consider the tourism sectors, right? So unfortunately, with oil spills, there is a disruption to recreational activities in the marine environment, such as swimming, boating, and diving, caused by oil-contaminated shores. But however, they're usually relatively short-lived. And so once the shorelines are clean and normal trade and activities can be expected to resume, it's often impacted by long-term and damaging economic impacts, and that's just because of public perception. Wide-scale pollution can remain wide-scale impacted perception can remain long after the oil has gone and long after the pollution has been cleaned up. And because of that, it usually tends to require combined strategies of advertising to counteract that degraded image. And the most vulnerable will be, those family-based businesses. And it's sort of important when having a management response strategy for oil spill to also consider those whose livelihoods depend greatly on the marine environment. And then we're talking about transboundary spills. So the reason why I'm covering this is because the Tobago oil spill, unfortunately, did extend beyond our national borders. And so there was a degree of geopolitics that came into play. And it was very important at that point to have the communication and the coordination in terms of where the oil has reached on the ocean surface. And there was a collaborative effort for trajectory modeling as well to try and predict where the oil was going or where it was more likely to travel to. And it's through the acknowledgement that satellite tracking is a useful tool for decision making in terms of management and response. So now we can get into the case study of the Tobago oil spill. So it is important to acknowledge that there was this oil spill detection and monitoring program in Trinidad and Tobago before the Tobago oil spill. We were trained in 2021, which I'll talk a little bit about just now, and we've been monitoring our nation's waters ever since for oil spills. And so this is currently a combined effort between the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries and the Institute of Marine Affairs. So Trinidad and Tobago exists in the South Caribbean, right there to the bottom of the Caribbean, north of Venezuela, and we have a history of oil and gas production, and particularly there's a dense number of oil-related infrastructure, whether it be platforms, wells, or pipelines in the southwest area of Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the reasons why this program came about was because we were acknowledging that we've always had acute oil spills. So from 2015 to 2020, the Environmental Management Authority received reports from public and from operators of over hundreds of spills. And in that 5-year period, you can see the breakdown for the number of spills as well at the bottom of the screen. Trinidad and Tobago does have a national oil spill contingency plan, and previously, this plan actually was enacted in 2014. Previously, the IMA was only responsible for oil fingerprinting, so collecting samples from spills and being able to run lab analysis to determine the type of oil that was spilled. Since then, we've had the added responsibility of the satellite tracking. And so this has helped with the policy and response. So as mentioned, we were trained in 2021. So this was an initiative that was a long time coming. In 2020, late 2020, there was a regional meeting with Ayo Caribe, and out of that meeting, there was a general consensus that we need to increase the capacity for monitoring of our ocean health, so monitoring of pollution sources and general natural phenomena. And the satellite analysis branch of the NOAA in the US reached out to IMA, and through the UNEP-CEP, so through the Caribbean arm of the UNEP program in, I want to say early 2021, as well as through GeoBlue Planet. And they would have reached out to us and inquired about our interest in receiving this oil spill monitoring training. We would have expressed interest, and we've also included partners from the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, as well as the Environmental Management Authority, because again, IMA only conducts monitoring and research. We are not an action agency. However, these two bodies are very much authorized to act in the management and response of oil spills. And so this is just a general timeline of the Tobago oil spill. On the morning of Wednesday 7th, I received a phone call from a colleague. Janice actually mentioned the agency earlier, the Tobago Emergency Management Authority. And he would have asked us if we heard anything about the oil spill of the southern cove of Tobago. And we would have then triggered a response for emergency oil spill tracking, which basically means that anytime a satellite image comes through, priority is given for the area of oil spill, so that we can get the reports out to the action agencies and to the response managers, which in this case was Tima from Tobago. They were on the ground and they were also providing information as it relates to like when we share a response. Sometimes they coordinate it for like drone surveys and for aerial surveys using our National Air Guard. And it was a form of validation for our satellite tracking. And it was also very important as it related to how we were utilizing the satellite images. So we had the first sighting, and the first oil spill report was issued for imagery that was collected on Wednesday 7th. And then we would have reached out to the satellite analysis branch in NOAA, because at the point in time we acknowledged that after the 7th we weren't going to get any kind of satellite coverage until Monday 12th. And you're looking at between the 7th and the 12th, 5 days of no satellite coverage in the very early stages of an emergency. And so it was really important at that point. I was like, oh no, we're not going to get anything. How are we going to be able to coordinate response, etc.? And so, especially for a large area, drone alone was not going to be able to effectively and efficiently give us coverage. So would have reached out to SAB, because SAB has commercial satellite support in terms of their own contracts with vendors, and they were able to provide for us images over that weekend. So from the 9th as well as the 11th, using very fine resolution as well, satellite imagery and products they're derived from, for us to share with these agencies for management and response. And it was very, very useful and very, very important. Following that, the UN Disaster Charter was activated. So that is through, again, GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, as well as the Disaster Charter. And that platform provides commercial satellite products, as well as open source satellite products for analysis. And that helps to inform, again, for management. So this would have been done regardless of whether or not Trinidad and Tobago had a monitoring program, a satellite monitoring program. But we really only use open source satellites to conduct our monitoring. So being able to access that, which then happened on the 13th, the IMA was provided with a credential login to be able to access those products. We were then able to use that to help infill and supplement those open source days. So that helped to give us almost like daily coverage for Trinidad and Tobago. Unfortunately, on Wednesday 14th, the oil was detected on the ocean surface to be leaving our EEZ, so leaving our exclusive economic zone and traveling into waters beyond our national jurisdiction. We would have then shared that with the Regional Activity Center for Oil Spills, so the RAC Rimpatech, for them to also do their coordination, because they are the regional center for oil spills. On Friday 16th, we would have received a request from Grenada for monitoring support, because at that point, oil did travel into their EEZ. I'll be sharing a little bit about that just now. And then on the 26th of February, we would have received monitoring support requests as well for Bonaire, because at that point they had some heavier oil fractions washing up, even though it was not visible on the ocean surface, which is what we're able to detect with satellites. It was washing up on their shores. So this is just a picture on February 7th, so on the first day that the vessel was reported by one of my colleagues in Timor. This was captured using a drone. And then we have an image here. The oil traveled along the coast of Tobago and it did flow into our port. On the lower right corner of this image, you see actually a vessel, and that was a cruise liner. And the cruise had to go through the oil to be able to dock in our port. And of course, that is an experience in itself for everyone on the vessel, but it did not have great impacts for us immediately. So this is an example of what some of those oil spill reports looked like. As mentioned, the oil traveled, so this would have been the vessel location. The oil traveled along the coast and was seen extending into our nearshore and offshore environment. And these are some examples of the commercial products that NOAA SAB was able to share with us that also showed this would have been on the Friday and this would have been acquired on the Sunday thereafter the initial report. And these are some examples of when the oil extended beyond our national waters and traveled into Venezuelan and Grenadian waters. So we were able, using the UN Disaster Charter platform, as well as the open source images, to create a bit of a historical timeline of how the oil traveled on the ocean surface. And so here you can see Trinidad and Tobago's waters, Grenada's waters, and Venezuelan waters, as well as we were able to monitor the vessel drift. So the vessel moved quite a bit from the initial report into as far as April 7th, where it was just drifting and dragging along the coral reef in the seabed. This was a web map that we were using, so it's particularly important to be able to create these visualizations of the location of oil for different types of users, you know. So sometimes it was easier for Timor to have a phone in front of them than to have a laptop, you know. And so it was really just about sharing the fastest and the most efficient and effective way for response managers. So I'm happy to say that we did not detect any oil in Grenada's waters in terms of in their nearshore environment. We would have monitored their waters consistently for a few months. And we would have been sharing this with their disaster management authority. We provided additional monitoring support for areas outside of our EEZ, even if it did not come from an official request from a country, simply because understanding how transboundary spills occur, you know, oil does not have eyes, it does not choose to go in this water versus that water. And so we would have monitored its location for quite some time. So up you know, from the 7th of February to the 14th of April, we were consistently issuing oil spill reports. This was one of the first no oil spill reports for Trinidad and Tobago with the vessel's location. And that would have, you know, continually occurred from that point until the middle of June. And as Janice mentioned, in April, there was the report that over 50,000 barrels of liquid waste was removed from either the water or from the shores of Tobago. Unfortunately, there was a change in marine conditions during a de-inventory phase. So in June, especially, they started to pump off, for lack of a better phrase, which is just, you know, me just trying to break down the de-inventory. So there were different compartments on the vessel that still contained oil that were not damaged, and as well as in the damaged compartments as well. So they started to pump that oil off onto a barge, and we got this report that over 32,000 barrels were pumped off. And that the inventory phase was completed on June 28th. However, from the middle of June, when we first started to see oil again leaking from the vessel, until the middle of July, this historical timeline was created for that period. And in the middle to the end of August, the vessel was actually refloated and it was towed to Trinidad. During that time period, there was again a little bit of oil that was seen just following the path of its towing. The oil quickly dissipated. It really wasn't even there a few hours after that. The vessel has been taken again to Trinidad, sorry, from Tobago, and there has been a bit of what do you call it? Scavenging works that was done. I'm happy to report that Trinidad and Tobago's government allocated 50 million US to Tobago, so to the Tobago House of Assembly, which is the local governance in Tobago, for cleanup activity. The initial cost of cleanup from the International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund, there was a meeting in April and then another one in May with our government and that fund towards cleanup estimations, as well as there was the opening of requests for compensation. And those initial costs actually came in at an estimation of US $20 million. That would have been in May. Since then, there's been a few different things that have come forward in terms of, after that, they did the inventory, they did the refloating and towing, they did the scavenging. I know Janice mentioned that they were looking for the owner of the tugboat and they did find them. So a little bit after our national budget was read, actually, so after the budget was read and they were having post-budget discussions in cabinet, our Minister of Finance actually confirmed that they did arrest the persons responsible for, or the persons that were tied to the vessel, which was the Solo Creed in Angola. So this would have actually been during the week of the 24th of October. I believe it was earlier that week. And I'm not entirely sure what is the current status since that arrest, but I do know that those owners were arrested by officials in Angola. And yeah, I'm going to stop there. Thank you for having me. And I think Desmond and Janice indicated that we would have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Nikia. That was an excellent talk. I think I really appreciated the point you made earlier on about the remediation can only happen as fast as the environment can help clear things up, because sometimes
Yes.
people or the general public will want to know, why haven't the government or why haven't the agencies done anything about it, or why is it still this way, not realizing that things take time. So it was really important, and I was glad to hear about even IMA's initiative to continue monitoring the spill outside of our EEZ to make sure that no other areas have been affected. So that was kudos to the IMA for doing that. So now we have around 10 minutes, I believe, Desmond, for questions, 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
Yeah, we could see how it goes.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes,
So if you have
so
a question,
go ahead.
oh, so if anyone has any questions regarding Nikia's presentation, just raise your hand and press the unmute button and take it away.
Okay, so I'll get started then.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have a lot of questions. Just to be clear, the type of oil that was spilled, was it categorized as light or heavy? What's the
It was a type of marine diesel that isn't technically heavy, but again, I am not a marine chemist. I'm also not a marine biologist. My expertise is in remote sensing, and so this is what I was able to share with you all.
Okay, so we don't know, do we know if
Yes,
some
so
of the
to be
oil has
able
been
to
on the bottom of the sea floor?
Well, to be able to file for any kind of compensation through the international compensatory funds, there are two different things that you need, right? So you need to find out things as it relates to the vessel. So those details as well as the oil type. So I do know that it was found out, they did the analysis and it was reported. I cannot say if it is any sediment because I have not done those surveys. As I think as recent as September, we were still waiting for the go-ahead from the ministry to be able to do some underwater surveys. And so until we receive that all clear, we will not be doing those surveys. I do know that it takes some time after the vessel was moved for it to be declared safe for diving, but yeah, that was the most recent thing. I'm not sure if anything happened beyond that. Right now, our coral reef ecologists are very busy with the marine heat wave and the bleaching. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right, so I'll suspend my other questions so that other people, I'll come back, but
Yeah, sure.
let's see if other persons have comments or questions.
We have
Oh,
one
I can stop
question from
sharing.
Mary Alice Adams. She asked, are these some type of cleanups USA service members help with?
So in the response for the Tobago oil spill, as far as I know, it was mostly locally handled and regionally handled. I'm not sure if there was any sort of US support, and I would not also be able to answer that question because I was not involved directly in the response, just in spatial intelligence and EO side of things.
Okay.
Okay. We also have a comment from Dr. Sylvia Calendar Carter. She said, well done. It was very informative backstory since as an avid beach goer. Oh, she lived through the experience in Tobago.
Oh, that won't have been. I would
Yeah.
be interested to find out your experience.
Yes, yes,
Because
This,
I was in Tobago for different meetings throughout the observational period. However, I did not actually see anything beyond the vessel's location
so Sylvia,
because
you,
I wasn't there the first few days to see any oil washing up.
Sylvia, do you want to unmute and expand on your comment or no? Okay. So, my other question is there, are there international guidelines and rules that help to prevent these oil spills?
Oh, definitely. So I know for a fact, for example, the Regional Activity Center that I mentioned, RAC Rampatech, they provide training very regularly for OPR, so for oil spills and response. Um, there is unfortunately a growing phenomenon of dark vessels and illegal trade of oil and products. Um, and unfortunately, it was one of these vessels that was the culprit in this oil spill. And that's why they would have had to have that very long process of investigation to really find the owners and find the vessel, which would have been the actual tugboat. Um, because although it was seen from some satellite imagery the days leading up to the spill, there was a darkened period where there was no vessel that could have been seen either from like IAS tracking or from other maritime markers. So
So
yeah.
apart from the fact that there are persons, individuals, you said about two persons have been arrested.
hmm
That's one aspect, but is there a company? Because I doubt those individuals will be able to pay $50 million or whatever. Is there a actual company behind this?
Well, that's what they've been investigating. So I do know that some of the intelligence agencies in the US has been supporting the investigation. Um, there are hobbyists that track dark vessels.
Okay.
And there was an article that came out, I think in March earlier this year, that would have actually identified the Solo Creed as the tugboat. Um, yeah, the bad thing about dark vessels is just that they're not, they're illegal, so they're not keeping up with the legal regulations and such that you're asking about to help prevent those oil spills. And they do operate on a whatever they want to do basis until court.
Mm.
And so, some people have started to look at them in their free time, and they have access to, I guess, different databases. I would say it would be helpful for those hobbyists to then share some
Mhm.
of their findings with
Mhm.
local authorities, and I do think they can try to, create that sense of responsibility within their own community. Um, and I guess we see how this will then, progress as time passes on, because there are different sources now for oil spills that there were not in terms of identification and monitoring a few years ago that now exist. So like Sky Truth is one of them. They reached out to the IMA to help with some of their beta testing. Um, oh, look, Dr. Calendar Carter responded.
Yes. She said she couldn't unmute.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
yes.
But she said that they bathed at Mount Irving and they just experienced a lot of anxiety, but nothing in the water. However, driving through Lambo, the odor was very strong and the oil was onshore on the road, which was closed off.
Yeah.
Yes, that was actually one. The fumes was a major problem and it resulted in the closure of some schools in the area,
Mhm.
as
But
well
that
as
would
some
have just been
businesses.
within the
Mhm.
first few days. I
Yeah.
didn't mention, so the oil spill happened on Wednesday 7th, and the following week was when we had Carnival in Trinidad and Tobago. And I know Tobago has its own carnival season, but it still experiences an influx of tourists during the period. And so all of those tourists would have been exposed on that shore, which is not the only shore. So as Dr. Calendar would have said, like Mount Irving is on the Caribbean coast, and those beaches were not affected in any manner by the oil spill. It really was just along the southern Atlantic coast.
I
Was
have a question.
uh-huh.
Sorry.
Okay, sure.
I just wanted to know, do you have any idea of the kind of technology being in the geoinformatics field of what these dark vessels may possess, why they can go dark? Because that is really interesting to me.
They do a lot of cloaking and cloning.
Mm.
So I know, for example, in this instance, they did clone their vessel details to another vessel that was in another part of the world at the
Oh,
same time.
yes, I think I
And they,
remember
they
reading
really
about
tried those
that.
kinds of tactics to, disguise themselves. So, the vessel can be off the coast in maybe the Gulf of Mexico in real, right? So I'm just using a hypothetical scenario. And the IS tracking would say that that vessel is really not in the Gulf of Mexico, it's in the Red Sea, you know.
Mm.
Mm.
And so it's those kinds of tactics that they use to operate. And it's not just for the illegal oil spill or des or diesel trade, but it's also for things like fishing. There's a
Mm.
lot
Mm.
of illegal fishing, and then they tend to use the same kinds of tactics. So
Wow.
on, using satellite imagery and aerial imagery or even drones, you can tell that a vessel is there. However, it's those kinds of marine traffic, IAS kind of markers that would actually give you information about the vessel.
Okay, I see Melody Thomas. She has a question. She said, I would imagine that cleanup once oil is ashore would be very difficult.
Correct.
Can you explain how beach cleanup differs from water oil collection?
Yeah, so they would use, okay, so on the shore, they would actually want to collect the oil. As Janice mentioned, there was sargassum during the period when there was washing ashore. And initially, the sargassum helped because the oil adhered to the sargassum before, like the sandy bit or whatever sediment on the shore. But then it worked against the folks that were involved and the volunteers because they started to decompose as sargassum does. And it created even more of a problem. So it was not just the oil fuel, it was now also like sulfur oxides and stuff from the sargassum decomposition. It was a very difficult effort, as you rightfully said, because of those kinds of unforeseen cleanup. They then would have taken those cleanups materials, so it would have been bagged and transported to a local landfill called Studley Park. in the first instance, where they were disposing of the cleanup materials was not the best place. And so they had requested, I'm trying to remember what month it was, either in March or April, IMA would have visited the Studley Park landfill to do an environmental assessment because they did not line the ponds before they disposed of the material, and so there was a little bit of leaching concern. However, we would have then conducted some environmental sampling, so they would have sampled for presence of hydrocarbons in the sediments and the nearby waterways. And as far as I know, nothing came up above the usual reporting requirements and levels. The water oil collection varies because of the type of oil. So whether it's something like a dispersant, chemically, or physical dispersing, or if it's something like the deployments of a boom, sorry, and then collection, which they did deploy booms, some of which failed initially, but some of which were more effective thereafter. So it really just differs in terms of the prevailing weather conditions, marine conditions, as well as the type of oil. Because I also know that so off the coast of Cove, there is a certain distance offshore that makes it particularly difficult to navigate within using small vessels. And I know that was also an issue that they were dealing with. TEMA, which was the Emergency Management Authority in Tobago, um, they don't have their own vessels as well, and that was another hindrance. They never really had to have a need for vessels in, in the past either. I'm also seeing that Dr. Calendar Carter talked about fish. So yeah, there is a fishing depot in Lambo. However, it was closed in the initial days, I believe. I also know that we received fishes to sample their tissues for the presence of DDPH and hydrocarbons. And I know there was a report that was put out that was dispelling any or trying to dispel public concern because the fish were safe to consume. Um, I know that was like after the first comments about the fish, but the fish were safe. And so, I think there was definitely a need for caution in how some of those things were reported initially, because you have folks whose entire livelihoods depend on these things.
Bridget has
But
a
yeah.
phone. Bridget, you could go ahead and speak.
Yes, forgive me. I stepped out of the classroom. I am Guyanese. I'm from Guyana. And I say that only because of the activity that is current in our country for oil extraction. I am a little emotional because, well, first let me ask a question. I joined late, so were there any local persons affected negatively in terms of the air, the water, food? Are there any deaths reported? None at all.
As far as I know, there were no deaths and there was no long-term intense or chronic exposure to the oil even through cleanup. Bridget, maybe I can help to address some of your concerns. So through the oil spill, there is a regional program called Costa, which is a collaboration on oil spill tracking in the Americas. And through that program, we've actually been in talks with NEPA, so with your local environmental agency, to get them to be part of the program. So we are speaking to a few persons in NEPA, trying to gauge their interest in terms of do they want to receive training and come on as monitoring partners, or would they prefer that we monitor the waters just for now, as as you mentioned, Guyana is in getting into oil production and exploration, and then they come on board as more agencies that have a bit more of a responsibility in the program. We are having those initial discussions right now using the very coordinative arm of the RAC Rampatech as well.
What
So
is the
there will also
involvement?
be, sorry?
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, so I was saying then that is towards the greater end of having Guyana's waters monitored for oil spills.
Yeah, isn't it remarkable that the monitoring mechanisms and the cleanup mechanisms are not in place, even as part of the agreement to extract oil from our countries? Um,
I
in
wouldn't say
terms of,
that.
well, I'm saying that on behalf of
Okay,
Guyana. We
sure.
are locked out. Guyanese are locked out of the entire operation. We're told to go and train for millions of dollars in the US before we can be hired. And so we have folk coming from Nigeria, Trinidad, everywhere but Guyana.
Mhm.
The cost is so exorbitant that it will be years before Guyanese can be used at all levels. It is a pity, and this is totally political. Our government has sold us out, and I am in tears. So forgive me for being emotional, but I said that up front. I trust that everything will work out for Tobago. Thank you so much. Thanks for a very informative presentation. Appreciate you.
No problem. I do know that Iraq has offered and has conducted training for oil spill response for Guyana. So perhaps it's just not reaching where it should be. Or perhaps even, sometimes persons get trained and then they don't go back with the training to their agencies. It could be one of those cases. But I can relay some of those concerns to my partners in Iraq.
Yes, and it's political because
Mm,
if the persons that are coming forward are from certain axes, then there will be a political fallout. So Iraq, notwithstanding, offering to do that,
understood.
brings into the region the entire global conflict east-west. So here we go again. And Guyanese are going to be crushed in the whole mix of money grabbing. This is grabbing the resources of countries that are still called developing countries. So it is a total international depletion of our resources at our expense. Forgive me.
So
That's okay, Bridget.
I wanted to ask about, can you give us more information about the dispersants that were used, are being used, but perhaps some of maybe the environmental impact of the dispersants themselves too?
So as mentioned, Desmond, I'm not a marine chemist. I'm not a biologist.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can't speak to those things. My
Oh,
background really is in GIS and in remote sensing, and our responsibility lies with tracking,
okay.
and detecting. But I can put you in touch with folks who can answer your questions.
Okay. So,
Yes.
but you know for a fact that they have been used. Chemical dispersants were part of the remediation.
Um, Not on a wide scale in Tobago and
Okay.
not near the coral reefs.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right.
hmm We would
Uh,
have shared a bit of a rehab and rehabilitation and response plan in the very early stages of the oil spill. Like we had persons that went over to Tobago to do an assessment as early as, let me tell you what the date was, because I just know it was a Saturday.
Okay.
As early as the 10th of February.
So
So,
3 days after. Okay.
yep.
Just to tap back on Bridget's question regarding health issues, as Nikia rightly said, there were few complaints from those actually on the ground cleaning up because TEMA as well as other agencies were sure to give people the proper PPE.
Yep.
However, there were several complaints from workers from different places, cafes in the area, that had to leave the job because of the fumes. They had problems breathing, being irritated, respiratory irritation, and so on. So there were those sort of acute effects. There were also a few complaints, I believe, from people in the schools, and people living around the area of the fumes. But I think, as Nikia said, nothing chronic, at least no reports of any chronic problems as a result of this spill, but
What,
definitely acute impacts.
what
And
about,
nothing over like 5 days.
okay.
Yeah.
It was really just in the first few days.
What about the impact on the coral reef, on Buku Reef? Do we know anything about that?
The oil was not detected coming across that coast. So
Okay.
not in Buko Reef. I know in Cove Reef, the vessel would have obviously, as it was lodged there, it dragged along and it would have broken up some coral. The assessment has not been done yet because we have not received the go-ahead yet.
So the oil spill impacted mostly what side of Tobago?
The southwest in terms
Southwest.
of the Atlantic coast, so the Cove and Flying Reef area.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was in Buko Reef, I think it was in July or sometime around there, and everything was fine.
Same. I did some diving in May, and on that coast, we actually went to Flying Reef in May, and we were able to dive there.
Okay.
Nice.
All right. Any other comments or questions? We've had a nice Q&A. So if there are no more questions or comments, we want to go ahead. I'd like to go ahead and thank our guest speaker, Nikia Gooden. Hopefully we'll stay in touch because I do want to know about the chemistry part of this.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be a future episode. Want to also thank Janice Germain for being a co-host here. And want to thank everyone who came on board, who participated in this episode. Thank you all very much. Hope you all have a wonderful Friday and a great weekend, and look forward to seeing you next week for Green Architecture. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you so
Elle.
much for having me. It was great.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thank
Same
you.
to you,
Bye-bye.
Nikia. Same to you,
Thank you.
Desmond.
All right.